Welcome to the Thresholds of Reality, the podcast where we explore unexplained and mysterious events, phenomena, and legends. Those of you in our audience who know, we have been exploring lately true crime and its past and present. And today with us we have Raquel. Is it Deserbelles?
Yeah, Raquel Deserbelles O'Brien. It's
Deserbelles
hard.
O'Brien. Almost got that.
You
Second
got
time.
it. You just missed the S.
From the Case Files and Silent Waves podcast, here to discuss with us her experience with this true crime podcast subjects. And for that, make sure that you strap in as we explore the edges of the unknown. Raquel, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you're coming from another continent to visit us.
Yes.
It's very exciting. We often have guests from other parts of the world, and it's always fascinating to hear different accents and different ways of life, and especially to know that we are connecting across this wide globe that we live on. True crime is kind of something that has captured a lot of people, and it's been something that has captured a lot of people for a long time. You know, there's Dateline NBC, and there's all these shows about, very violent histories and, how they kind of touch a lot of people's lives in different ways. And sometimes the circle of, the ripples of those violent crimes are very close to us, and they can be very powerful, and sometimes they're very distant, and they just barely kind of are noticed in our lives, or maybe in kind of a transient way they kind of affect us, and then we move on to the next thing. But sometimes, and I think in your case, those experiences hit us in such a way that we feel those ripples for a long, long time. How did you decide that you were going to be investigating true crime?
Yes. Well, Sam, thank you so much for having me. And my story is an interesting one because when you talk about the ripples being close to home, the ripples of true crime were happening in my home environment. So I grew up in a home environment that seemed to the outside world quite perfect, but behind closed doors, there was a lot going on. There was financial fraud, there was abuse, sexual abuse, and I myself was a victim of sexual abuse from a family member. So that kind of was happening. I didn't associate it with crime. I think as a young girl, I associated crime and true crime with like serial killers and those cases that exist outside of what you know. And then it all culminated, I guess, all of the trauma that I had from growing up the way that I did and the experiences that I had. I found that it was debilitating my life. And a friend of mine who's a documentary maker, she recommended that we decide to bootstrap and do a podcast. And so what I did is I spent 2 years when I was 24 years old back in 2018. I spent 2 years just interviewing my family members about our shared history. Mind you, the head of our family by this time, my father, he had committed suicide when I was 16, and he was kind of the head figure of our family, and he was one of the people that was inflicting the abuse on a lot of the family members. So there was a sense of unresolve, and I wanted to try to understand my story and understand myself better. Embarked on this process, 2 years interviewing my family, all of these revelations, and I realized at the end of it that although it was my personal narrative, it was tied to a collective story, and a lot of people were having similar experiences to me, and I wanted to share that with the world. So that culminated into the making of Silent Waves. It's a 7-part podcast series where I interview my family members about our shared history, and I tie it in with interviews with judges, lawyers, psychologists, professionals in the space to demonstrate that there is a collective narrative that's happening. And a lot of times, abuse is happening in our homes, and we're not associating it with crime, even though it absolutely is.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, a lot of times the crime or the abuse goes unseen, but if it were happening out in the open, of course, everyone would immediately understand that that's not legal and that's
Yeah.
not okay. Um, so, what was it like to kind of dig up those shared traumas with family members?
Ultimately, it was extremely cathartic. I do have a very supportive family, so I was lucky in that sense. But when I was doing it in the moment, it was it was insanely challenging, and it was very difficult. All of these emotions that I hadn't dealt with were surfacing. I felt like giving up a lot of time. I felt like something was wrong with me, that I'll never get through to the other side. And I didn't understand the power of narrative healing, which kind of ties into why I continued in the space of storytelling and releasing our pain through sharing our stories. So I was really blessed in the sense that I could do that, and I could do that and be supported by my family in the telling of our story, because I know a lot of people don't have that privilege of having supportive family networks. I was really lucky that I did. So yeah.
Was there a certain structure to the podcast that about your family story that you were going for? Were you just trying to kind of tell every detail of what happened? When we were talking about narrative healing or narrative healing, I think was the phrase that you used. Uh,
Yeah.
was it basically like trying to put together the novel or the novella of what happened?
Yes, it really was. We wanted to structure it like a play, because we kind of identified that sometimes when you're in these institutions, these family institutions, to uphold a facade, each person plays a role. So we really took that motive and we structured the storytelling in that way. It was interesting for me. I was interviewing my family members. So obviously my family members feel comfortable to share really private and personal moments with me. It's not like they're being interviewed by a journalist. So in the editing process, it was really difficult to determine what I needed to share with the public and what was just to be left in that space that I interviewed them, because I didn't want to give a sensationalized account of what it is to live in an abusive household. I wanted people to connect with the humanity of the storytelling and explore the gray areas in crime and criminal activity and criminals, because when you're talking about family members, as an example, there's love involved. So you can't look at the story in the same way I can look at it from a distance. If it's a serial killer that I'm watching on Netflix, I'm not emotionally attached to that person or their story or their family. So I can look at them in a more black and white sense. When it's your father that you're discussing, you have to navigate the love that you have for that person and match it with the fact that this person was a very, very, very problematic and really negatively impactful person. So it was difficult, and I wanted to demonstrate that nuance in true crime telling.
Yeah, when I was young and my parents would tell me about, so I have a lot of siblings. I'm
Mm.
number 7 out of 9 kids.
Oh, wow.
And as my family would tell stories about our own little history, not that anything like what you experienced does not refer to anything like that, but I always got the sense that I was coming in maybe the second act or the third
Yeah.
act of
You
the,
know what I
the
mean?
play. Um, Tell me about how you might have had any sort of difficulties in relaying that tale from your perspective, um, coming in as a child, versus maybe somebody who was from an older generation watching it unfold in real time.
Yeah, for me, as like coming in from the perspective of a child, it was really hard for me to understand the context that created the environment in which I was raised. I didn't know much about my father's history, for example. I had to investigate that. My mother, she's from Brazil, so she's from a whole different culture. I wasn't raised speaking Portuguese, so it was hard for me to tie that cultural element into my family story. It was really difficult for me to process the emotions of shame and guilt and feeling like I was, for lack of a better word, burdened by my father's mistakes. It was really hard for me to process that because there was no sense of resolution with my father, because by the time the story all came out, he had already passed over. So I was never able to sit down with my father, who inflicted all of this pain on our family, and say, why did you do it? Do you love us? All of these questions were left unanswered. So that was really, really painful for me for a long time. The other thing that was interesting for me to navigate was to understand that oftentimes cycles of abuse, as an example, they're intergenerational. So oftentimes people who are abused will turn into abusers and vice versa. And so to find that out about my father as an example, and to look at my mum's family line and see all of the abuse that was happening for generations in that family as well, it was really confronting for me, because I thought, hey, I'm the first generation that can put a stop to this, and we can generate other cycles. So the last episode of Silent Waves, as an example, is called Unlocking Chains in Cycles, because it's about starting new cycles where abuse isn't present in our family line.
Okay, that's wonderful, and when there are moments of breaking free from
Yeah,
those types of cycles and destructive um,
ways
destructive
of being.
habits, and just people can get stuck. It's if you
Yeah.
suffer trauma, it's really hard to leave that moment. you know
Yes.
a lot of times repeated trauma, it might be different, but people who suffer a singular moment of trauma, they get stuck there, and they
Yeah.
live that moment. It's hard for them to ever to escape it without doing something to deal with it. And this process of putting together this podcast, you describe a catharsis. One of the things, though, is there must have been a moment where you were trying to decide where you fit in the story. Were you a main character, a side character? Who did the story revolve around, and where did you kind of fit
Right.
narrative?
Totally revolved it totally revolved around me. It was my story, and my family members were the characters in my story. So it was from my point of view. It was initially, I decided to do it because of self-accountability. You speak about trauma, and for me, it was showing up in my life. I was in a relationship and I was being physically abusive to my partner at the time, and I didn't understand how or why that was happening. I consider myself quite a peaceful and generous and kind person, and then all of a sudden I would have these rage blackouts. So I was like, well, what the hell is going on here? So I said, I'm going to hold myself accountable to end this cycle of abuse, and to in order to do that, I'm going to have to go back in time, and I'm going to have to figure out how I got to the point that I'm being physically abusive to my partner. So the story was definitely from my perspective, and everyone played a secondary role in the telling of my story. It was really about my story of being a survivor of child sexual abuse, and in the home environment. I wasn't finding people talking about this. I didn't have resources. I didn't hear my story being shared. So I said, well, surely it's not just my own. Maybe I can do this for someone else. And we ended up getting to number one. So I was very happy about that
That's awesome.
on iTunes.
Um, okay,
Yeah.
so we've kind of been dancing around it a little bit, but what happened? If you can, tell us in a
I'll give you the elevator pitch.
yeah.
Yeah, the elevator pitch of what happened. Okay, so basically what happened was I 12 years old. As I mentioned, my mom's from Brazil. My cousin, who's from Brazil, came and stayed in our family home. He was 30 at the time. I was 12, as I mentioned. And so what happened was for 2 years, I was groomed and then raped, sexually abused in my room, constantly, night in, night out, by my elder cousin. Okay, so that happened 12 to 14. He ended up going, living his life. Then when I was 16, my father, he ended up committing suicide. He was enveloped in financial fraud allegations. He was basically going to jail, prison for fraud, and he decided it was time to take his own life. So 16 takes his own life. At 16, my world crashes. We're left with no money. He's left my mum in all of this debt. My mum was a housewife, so she had no job, no employment, 4 kids. And then my cousin comes back in my life. I'm overwhelmed with rage. I decide it's time to break my silence. I'm 16. By the time I'm 18, I'm in court and I win my case. So my cousin actually goes to prison for sexually assaulting me way back then. I think it's over. I think, oh, finally I can get on with my life. That was really effed up, but let's continue on. Then at 20, my eldest brother, he calls me and he says, Raquel, I have to tell you something. Dad sexually molested me when I was a kid. So my father sexually molested my brother, and that is when my world absolutely crashed, because up until that point I had my father on a pedestal, and I guess I really revered him and thought he was a king. And then that was smashed right in front of me, but I had no way of going and expressing that rage, anger, wanting to understand. I couldn't do that to him. So I just bottled it up. And that's when my trauma started seeping out in all types of ways in my life, up until the point when I was 24 and I decided I wanted to do something about it, because I thought, oh man, I'm too young to be so depressed. Like, I've got a whole life. I can't live 70 more years in this state. I've got to do something about it, which comes into the telling of my story.
Very okay. That's very heavy stuff.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that takes a lifetime to unpack, you know,
Yeah.
and really get to the bottom of it. But uh, it sounds like this podcast and this opportunity to speak to your family members, if not your father, was at least a start to find peace, if not to achieve it. Um,
Yeah.
and that thought of, I don't want to live the next 70 years of my life in this state, that's an important decision, because you're taking control of your emotional state
Yeah.
and deciding how you are going to be affected by that traumatic event. Very important decision, I think, you made in that moment. So after you put together the podcast, you released it. It did very well. How did your family react to the podcast going live?
So they loved it, and I didn't share it with them. They were listening along with everyone else because we would release an episode a week. So I didn't give them a private screening of it because they said, Raquel, I trust you with the telling of your story. This is about you. Do as you will, and we will support you regardless. It was really important for me, that trust in what I was about to create. So they would call me every week and they would just be floored. They really loved it. So that for me was enough. Just the fact that my family loved the telling of our story and that I was able to condense it in a way that was neatly packed, because as you can imagine how messy the telling of that story can get if you really sit down and dissect it. It's like it's an endless pit there. You can really just keep going down and down and down and down and down. It's never ending.
Yeah, I can imagine that there's a lot of graphic details that you could go into to kind of sensationalize.
Yes.
You wouldn't, I don't know if that's an approach you would want to take, but um,
No.
it seems like the kind of thing that you could really use to really draw out some strong emotions in an audience. I'm having kind of a strong reaction to it as well. I'm a father of many children
I
myself,
apologize.
and I when I think about that kind of thing, it does hit me in a very personal way because I spend a lot of time trying to protect my kids from that kind of thing. But
I can imagine.
but it's an important thing that we all need to be aware of. It happens, and it happens a lot more than we might be conscious of. Certainly, it has led you into this life of podcasting, discussing other people's stories too, right?
I know, which is what I wasn't expecting at all. Mind you, when I started the podcast way back when, I didn't even know what a podcast was. My friend said, "Hey, you want to make a podcast?" I said, "Yeah, okay, what's that?" And I used to make that mistake of like, I can't wait to watch it, back in, because it was just audio. And so I had to learn what a podcast was. And what happened was, the founder of Case File, which is Australia's #1 true crime podcast, he came across Silent Waves one day. He always tells the story. He was going for a run, and he said that when he heard my story, it stopped him in his tracks. And it stopped him in his tracks because he had a similar experience when he was a child. So he was resonating with my story. Once he listened to the whole thing, it coincided the timing where he was wanting to launch his own podcasting platform, which is called Case File Presents, where they could provide a platform for other shows to reach a wider audience, because Case File's got a huge listener base. And Silent Waves was the first show that he picked up to put on this platform. And the ripple effect of that was that he shared his experience with me, and then we would talk for about 2 years, and he would say, Raquel, you should have your own show and you should platform other people's stories because you're a great listener, you've got an interesting story, and so do other people. Platform them. And I said, no, 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 no. Imposter syndrome. No, Brad. Oh, I shouldn't have said his name, but anyway, no anonymous, no anonymous, no anonymous. And then I said, wait a minute, why the hell am I saying no to this incredible opportunity? What is wrong with me? And so he offered to be my first guest, and it was one of the first times he did a public interview, and he actually shared his experience with his listener base. So that in itself was absolutely incredible. I was able to hold space for him to do that and for people to connect with this person that they've been listening to since 2016. So I've been involved in Case File since 2018, and it's turned into my career. And I just love storytelling. I love the gray area of true crime, and I love having the opportunity to platform alternative versions of the crime genre, because there's a lot of people that are talking about the serial killers and the deranged psychopaths, and I want to talk about when it's not so obvious. I want to talk about things that aren't being spoken about as much. So that's where I work and operate in.
So I have recently become a fan of kind of darker media, horror genre,
Have you?
thrillers, those kinds of things. And
Yes.
one of the things that really strikes me, especially in the horror genre, is that the the monster or the dark entity that they face is always an analog or a parable for actual trauma that people face in real life. One example is
Mhm.
in the series Netflix series the Haunting of Hill House. There's a scene where one of the main characters, she's like a social worker, and she's going and visiting a young girl who's talking to her about this smiley face that is terrorizing her, and how she wakes up in fear of this smiley face that's attacking her. And she goes to investigate the home where the girl lives, and she's in foster care, and so she's just kind of looking around, and she ends up in the basement of the house, and she looks up, and in the wood framing of the house she sees what looks like a smiley face, and it leads her to an experience where she understands that what the girl's experiencing, she's assigning to this smiley face that she sees in the wood paneling. But in actuality, she's being abused by the foster dad, and she's kind of made this
Mm.
mental emotional connection with this made up character. And it's like, okay, so they've she in her mind created this analog between an imaginary entity that was terrorizing her and the actual trauma that she was suffering. And she made this kind of replacement in order to try to convey that in a secret way, I guess. But um,
Yeah.
the darkness that people face, it seems like they are always trying to find a way to talk about it without revealing too much of their secrets. Um, what's the
Yes.
secret to getting people to talk about the darkest moments of their lives?
The secret that I found is to be honest about your own. I think that once you demonstrate that you're able to, people will feel safe enough or comfortable enough to start telling you things that that they've never shared before. And I've had that experience with countless people. It to the point where these days, sometimes I just sit with someone and they just start telling me of their own accord. I don't even have to say anything. It's something I don't know if it's energetic. I don't know what it is, but they just feel comfortable enough to start sharing. And I think when you're schooled or when you understand like trauma and what people are the underlying messages that people are saying, you can kind of tease out the truth, because they'll always give it to you in an obscure way at first. They'll test the water. They'll test the water with you. The smiley face motive is such a great example. And then it becomes about you hearing what they're saying behind what they're actually vocalizing, because they're always looking for someone to share their secrets with. No one wants to hold that in for the rest of their life. And I think back to my own experience, I would always test people in certain ways to see if they would pick up on my pain or my trauma, or if they would be able to figure out and decipher that I was being abused by my cousin. Like, come on, figure it out. Like, I don't want to have to tell you, figure it out. That was always my wish and my desire. I just didn't want to have to say it.
Yeah, I
I
imagine
don't
that.
know. That's what I think anyway.
Yeah, I imagine that for a lot of people, having to admit that you've suffered through something that still haunts you uh, can bring up a lot of social anxiety. Am I going to appear like I'm trying to play the victim? A lot of kind of self punishment in those moments. Um, but yeah, I would imagine it takes a lot of practice and a lot of experience to give somebody the comfort that they need to divulge or share their stories with you.
And may I say, Sam, when I first started sharing my story, just to people in general, when I first started feeling comfortable with the fact that I could allow people to hear my truth, I had no filter. It was really terrible. I was working at a cafe at the time, and old mate Greg would come in for his morning coffee, and he'd be like, "Hi Raquel, how are you today?" And I would say, "Oh, Greg, just processing that my father was a pedophile that committed suicide." And poor Greg, imagine Greg trying to enjoy his morning coffee after that, because as you say, it's really heavy. So you've got to be delicate with telling people your truth as well, because the people on the other side, they sometimes it's the first time they're hearing something of this nature, and so you can't expect them to just be able to hold space for you. Greg was just trying to enjoy his morning coffee. It wasn't the right place or space for me to just dump that. So I had a lot of trouble for about 2 years there. I definitely just didn't learn it. It was sometimes I think back and I think, oh, how did people even support me? How did I not lose my job? That was another thing. I didn't get fired either. So yeah, and I just wanted everyone to listen to me. Once I was comfortable about speaking about it, I thought that every time someone handed me the mic, then I had to just yell my story to the world. And that wasn't conducive to my well-being in the long term. After a while, I thought, oh my gosh, surely there's other parts of my identity that I can explore beyond this narrative of pain and trauma, right? Because there comes a point where you have to kind of leave that to serve its purpose without you just rehashing it and rehashing it and rehashing it all the time. At some point people think, oh my God, can we talk about something a little lighter for a second, Raquel? I said, not yet. So I was blessed to have people who were supportive.
Yeah. It's funny. It's funny you say that. I had an experience this summer, kind of tangential to that, where my dodgeball league went to Italy to compete in this tournament, international tournament. And one of the players on my team, he and his wife came along with me and my wife when we were basically like travel buddies the whole time. And they talked about how they were part of these therapy groups, and it was nice to take a trip that had nothing to do with the trauma they had suffered. And
It's so important.
it was just something fun, something very superficial, something memorable, but it had nothing to do with the pain that they had suffered. And so they were developing this other part of their life and creating memories in that space. Um, but obviously, we're here to kind of explore more about true crime, and um, I guess my question would be, what has been? Do you have a focus on the stories that you seek out? Um, and if you don't have a focus, is there recurring themes that end up appearing in your podcast?
I so initially my focus, I didn't get like when I was asked to do the show, I had free reign, which for me was absolutely overwhelming. I say, well, what's the brief? Like, what do you want me to do? Whatever you want. And oh God, I'm indecisive at it as it is. So I was like, well, what do I want to talk about? And then I realized that connecting to my own personal story, a question that always loomed over my head was, what is justice? Because when I went through the court system and I won my case, I was left with this feeling that, is that what they call justice? Like, this is what it feels like for justice to be served. I didn't feel like that I was an outcome that was beneficial to anyone. I wanted to know, hey, what can we do so that my cousin doesn't continue to abuse other people? Like, what about prevention? And does he need rehabilitation? Like, is it an illness or is he a manipulator? So all of these questions were looming around my head. And I thought, okay, justice. I'm interested in justice. I'm interested in talking to people from all walks of life. And I'm inspired by stories of transformation. So that's kind of my focus. And I like to shake it up. So one week I could be interviewing, for example, someone who was a member of the Bloods gang in Pasadena, California, who went to prison for 28 years because he killed someone in a revenge killing. And then in prison, he had this spiritual awakening where he found God, and now he's out working in the community to help other gang members leave that life and be community members. So I will interview someone like that. Then I'll interview someone who's a professional on coercive control to understand the mechanisms of manipulation. And then I'll interview an NCIS detective. Then I'll interview my brother about what it's like to have our father, who's a monster, like a societal monster. What's it like to be raised by a monster of society? What's that like for you? So that's kind of, I always want to shake it up, because what interests me about this whole dominion is how complex and how many perspectives you can bring in to talk about different angles of crime and that genre. So I always want to be kind of doing something a little different and platforming stories that maybe we're not hearing enough of. I like to make people think and question their own thoughts. So that would be what motivates me. I would never cover like a cookie cutter case of like, oh, this person is inherently bad and then they did this and they're a psychopath. It doesn't really interest me. I think that's being done enough in the genre,
Yeah, that's very
I
interesting.
would say.
Yeah, that's true. It's interesting you bring up the theme of justice, because that's my line of work. I'm a lawyer, and I spend a lot of time trying to seek justice. Uh, Not in the
So are
criminal
you,
arena.
which
I don't
end
do
are you
criminal.
on?
I do civil. But
Oh, I was gonna say.
I had a client of mine complain because we won the case, but she felt like she was dealt with unjustly or unjustly, because she had to pay me my fee. She had to pay me my fee. She didn't get the other guy to pay 100% of it. It was like 90% of it. And so she was upset. She was like, "How's that just? How's that fair?" And that's one of the unfortunate side effects of this particular system that we have in the U.S. is that little
Yeah.
old ladies end up having to pay a lawyer to fight for them. You have to pay to have your champion stand before the judge and win your case for you. And
But what would you say justice is as an example? Like, how do you even define justice?
that's a really difficult question, honestly. And what I would say is justice, the most important part about justice is the application of the rule of law to everybody in the same way. That everybody have the right process, because without the right process, you can't get the right result. And everyone has the rights in this country, everyone has rights that they're guaranteed. It's not the same in every country. Not every country is just. Not every country is dedicated to the rule of law. And when you talk about true crime, that's something that comes up a lot, is you have pieces of evidence that are fabricated or that are slipped in because investigators or attorneys, prosecutors, they thought, this person is so uniquely evil that it justifies putting our thumb on the scale against them. And that's wrong. That's not justice. It can never
Mhm.
be justice. If
Yeah.
someone has already prejudged, that's prejudice, right? That's where prejudice and it comes from. It's prejudge. Someone has already prejudged the defendant to be uniquely evil, that the system can't be trusted to deliver the right result. That's wrong. That's not justice.
Uh, Right. And we're sold this idea that people are innocent until proven guilty, and we believe that to be true. However, at least from my interviewing, I don't know that that applies to all cases. I don't know that people are presumed innocent. I think a lot of people are presumed guilty until they can prove themselves innocent, depending on their socioeconomic background, as an example. I know in the US, I speak to a lot of people and race comes up a lot. I don't know what your perspectives are, but it's not as that's why the gray area really, really interests me. And, for me as well, from being victimized and going into a cross examination. Just think about that power imbalance as an 18-year-old girl who was trying to share my experience and my truth, all the shame that I was feeling, and then having a 60-year-old lawyer telling me I was lying. That was there's a huge power imbalance in that. They can manipulate me to say certain things in certain ways, or they can shame me or make me question my own account of the story. And that power imbalance is bizarre for me, as thinking as a child going through the criminal justice system. So it's just complex in every sense of the word.
Yeah, and to the point that you kind of alluded to when you were telling your story about, is this justice? Um, there's the result often doesn't match the wound that was created, or the wound that was
Yeah.
inflicted. And it's really, really difficult for people to move on when they feel like they haven't been treated fairly, or they haven't seen the proper punishment doled out. And it's a really tough situation that gets created, because it feels like a lot of times the law applies to different people differently. And that's
Yes.
something that and I guess in my activism, if you want to call it that, that's something that I really strive to correct, which is that the law needs to apply to everybody fairly and evenly, and try to eliminate as much as possible bias towards one group or another, um, in order to provide a dependable result. And
Mm-hmm.
you might have been told, "Hey, this is what justice is," and then when the moment came, you're like, "I don't feel like this is justice. I feel like
Exactly what happened to me.
this gave him too much leniency, or um, he's not suffering enough to pay for the crimes that he committed against me and against the family or the society or whatever." And that is a common sentiment. How does
Yeah.
that judge banging that gavel and saying 15 years or 20 years, how does that ease my pain? And
Yeah.
that's a weakness in the justice system. It cannot give you catharsis. It cannot give you absolution. It cannot give you
Right.
moral clarity. It's a bunch of people who are doing the best they can to figure out what the truth is. And this is the best system we've come up with, but it is flawed. It's flawed from top to bottom. And so
Mm-hmm.
if you're a religious person, that's where I'd say that's where you'd have to turn for that feeling of actual justice, is to a power beyond our own.
It's so interesting you say that, because, for me with the justice question, it wasn't that I was really uncomfortable with the fact that justice is geared towards punishment, because really, if we're looking for prevention, wouldn't we want to make sure that these things don't continue to happen in the scale that they're happening? And so how do we get to the root of that problem, instead of just waiting for it to happen, then slap someone and say, go to jail for 4 years, and
Yeah.
then
Well, I think that's the effort that you're involved in, right? You're talking about the stories of transformation
right,
and that process.
right.
And it goes
And
so
my
far beyond.
experience.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
It goes so far beyond. I was just going to say my experience. You mentioned religion, and one thing that I've identified is a lot of people who speak about transformation, whether or not they're religious, it's almost like it's faith-based living. Is they turn to something, whether it's a higher power, some outlet where they can put their faith, and they leave it to this higher power. And in my experience, that's where catharsis really starts happening, where transformation starts happening. And it definitely was the case for me. That's how I was able to start liberating myself from pain and trauma. So I think that is something to be explored. And I know that in Australia, as an example, if you mention God, people think you're like trying to preach to them like a Jehovah's Witness, and they're like, oh, don't mention God in front of me. But now that I live in Brazil, it's a faith-based society. So people are a lot more open to talking about God or the high power or the universe or whatever you
Oh,
want to call it. There are all different types of religions that are all congregating here, and it's been liberating for me to be able to have these conversations without people looking at me like I'm trying to convert them.
yeah, it's true. I used to live in Mexico, and it's the same thing. They like punctuate every
Right.
sentence or every commitment rather with if God is willing. If God willing,
We
I'll
do
be.
that, God willing.
Yeah,
Exactly. Sadilski said we do the same.
yeah. And it's just kind of this subtext in every conversation is you have this thread of faith or thread of religion that permeates every conversation and the language itself. And it's it's interesting to kind of mesh these different ideas across different cultures and see how they interact. Um, but we're running out of time, so thank you so much for sharing your story. I do want to share the website, the homepage here. I think this is your podcast, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's my personal story, Silent Waves. Yes.
Okay. And Casefile is the platform where you guys stream. This can be
Case File Presents. Mhm.
this up here
And
for.
there's also my other show, Unfiltered, on there, which is my newest edition.
So that's the website there. You said unfiltered. Casefile unfiltered.
Yes, that's the one. Thanks, Sam.
So, for everybody listening or watching, please make sure that you support Raquel and her podcast. She's so generous to share her time with us here today. Thank you, Raquel, so much for being here and sharing your story. It's a pleasure to meet you, and often it's hard to find people who are as brave as you to go out and share that kind of story with the world. Thank you so much. And to our audience, make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to see more content like this, hopefully we'll get Raquel back to tell us more stories about the people that she hosts on her show. Any final thoughts?
Sam, I just really wanted to thank you for giving me this opportunity to share a little bit about my story. I love sharing it because maybe someone has listened to it and has connected in a way where they feel that maybe they could share their own to someone, whether it's publicly or just personally in a safe space. So I really enjoyed our conversation, and thank you.
Thank you. And until next time, keep on exploring the edges of the unknown.